Hi everybody, this is Mr. Nolan, and I just want to talk to you about what we are doing right now with our juncos, with our birds. In the last lesson, what we saw, the main important thing that we learned, was that the results of the Common Garden experiment indicate that behaviors of boldness in juncos are inherited. We find that the offspring from San Diego are much more bold than the offspring from Mount Laguna. So that's sort of old news. We know that already. But our question today is, what is causing that? So we want to keep sort of digging deeper into this question. You know, how are the populations different? Why are they different? Okay, so we know that it's inherited. Well, let's take it one or two steps further and say, you know, what exactly is being inherited to make the birds from UCSD bolder and the mountain birds a little more shy? So our central question here for today is sort of just what are some differences in the birds? That's sort of the operating phrase, in the birds, that explains their differing behaviors. We've got our two populations. So what we're going to do is talk about what are some things that could be causing these differences in the birds. I want to go through an abstract excerpt with you just to kind of talk about what is this excerpt supposed to say, because it's kind of complicated. I'll show you some graphs, and our next lesson will be on scatterplot. So the next part, the next video will be on interpreting, reading and interpreting, creating scatterplots. So our central goal here is to be able to connect certain chemicals with boldness in juncos. So you will need your juncos packet in front of you if you're watching this video now. If you don't have it, you can download it in the link that's at the bottom of in the information section of this video. I will show it to you on screen so that you know what we're doing, following along. So the first questions that you can sort of use as a warm-up is right here for lesson 13. This is where we are. I'm going to ask you to connect to the previous lesson. What did we find out in the last class about what's causing the differences in boldness of the UCSD juncos and the mountain birds? I kind of just hinted at that at the beginning. And then what questions do we still have about what's causing these different behaviors in the two populations of juncos? So before we go any further in the video, take a moment, if you haven't done this already, to please just pause and to respond to these questions. What's the main point about boldness that we learned in our last lesson? And what questions might you still have about what's causing these different behaviors? So go ahead and pause that, and then we'll discuss about where do we want to move, in what direction do we want to move in this study. So go ahead and pause, respond to those two questions, and then jump right back. So the main things that we considered here for connecting to the previous lesson was what I mentioned, that the behaviors in the juncos are inherited. That's really the most important thing. The behaviors that we're seeing in our juncos are inherited. They're not learned. They're also not plastic. They will not change very much in the course of a bird's lifetime, and so they really can't change the way they behave. They're kind of stuck that way. And an important question that a lot of students came up with was, is there a chemical difference in the juncos that caused them to behave differently? We saw that happen in our bees study. We saw there was a chemical difference in the bees. So maybe there's a chemical difference in the juncos. Well, in order to kind of move us in that direction, I want you to think for a minute, what chemicals can you think of in the body that might affect how bold you are? Or the inverse is how anxious you are. Are there some chemicals in your body that might affect how anxious you are? And I want you to try to be specific, and I want you to think of specific names of chemicals or maybe hormones that you've heard of that might affect how fearful or nervous you feel. So if you'd like to do this exercise, pause the video again for just a moment and try to think, what maybe are some particular chemicals that might make you feel fearful or nervous or affect your boldness. So let's think of some of these chemicals that students brought up. Did you come up with maybe adrenaline? This is a really common idea that students came up with. While adrenaline can make you kind of feel nervous, make your heart beat, make you sweat, make you shiver, it definitely has those physiological impacts on a person. Maybe dopamine. Some people mentioned, well, dopamine is a chemical in your brain that makes you feel maybe happy. Lack of dopamine can make you maybe feel sad. Clinical depression is maybe linked to dopamine deficiencies. Some people mentioned these hormones, testosterone and estrogen. These probably really don't affect how nervous you feel, not as much as adrenaline. Serotonin, which is another sort of happy chemical. Some people even mention caffeine and nicotine, drugs that, if you get them into your body, they can affect how you feel. The one that we're interested in is called cortisol. So it's not like I expected you to bring up that term cortisol, but this is actually a chemical in humans that affects your level of anxiety. So in humans, it's called cortisol. It is released into the bloodstream either in response to a stressor, something that stresses you out, or a low blood sugar levels. And so it causes what's called gluconeogenesis. And this is just a fancy Latin Greek term for sugar, gluco, new, and then creation, which is genesis is the word for creating. So it creates new sugar is what cortisol does in humans. It's one of the things it does. It also causes you to feel stress and anxiety. If you have a lot of cortisol in your blood, it means that you're feeling stressed out. It also suppresses your immune system. So if you're stressed out all the time because you've got high cortisol levels in your blood, you're probably going to get sick more frequently. So it suppresses your immune system, and it actually shaves off years from your life. So if you're stressed out all the time, if you have really high cortisol levels, it really it takes a pretty heavy toll on your longevity. It also inhibits bone formation, so that's bad. So especially at your age, at high school age, you definitely want your bones to be able to form properly. So you don't want high cortisol levels. But in birds, the chemical that we're looking at is called corticosterone. It's a very close relative of cortisol. It's just tiny little differences. If you look right here, right where my cursor is, you'll notice there's just one little difference between these as I go back and forth between the slides. It's this hydroxide group, this little OH. So this is the difference between what birds have and what we have. We have got this extra little OH group, this hydroxide group, and birds don't have it. They have a slightly different chemical called corticosterone. It has the same effect on birds that it has on people. It comes from their adrenal glands, which is near your kidneys. It elevates their physiological responses to stress, just like it does in humans. It's correlated with anxiety and related behaviors such as higher heart rate, heavy breathing, shaking, sense of fear, etc. So this chemical is partly responsible for when birds feel very nervous. If there's a stressor in the environment, you get a big flood of corticosterone in our birds, and that also causes them to have more frightened responses to stimuli. So what I want to do right now with you is start looking at the results of a study. I'm going to show you where the study is in your packet in a separate video so that this one isn't too long. I'm going to annotate it with you. So I'll read it and then we'll go through it one step at a time, and we will go ahead and kind of see what is this study. Well, I'll summarize it really quickly here, but there's a separate video on this. So in your packet on the next page, you'll find an abstract from the original publication. And I'll kind of summarize the abstract. Basically what they say is that they're interested in figuring out if there's a connection between corticosterone, this chemical, and boldness in birds, in our juncos. And so what I want to do is show you the results of this study that's in this abstract. And I'm also going to ask you to please annotate the abstract with me in the other video that I'm going to put out. But for right now, it's okay to just summarize and say, well, they measured corticosterone levels in the birds, and they used that to figure out if it's connected to their responses. So again, in that other video, please watch it and annotate it with me if you have not already in class. So what did they find? What did the researchers find? Well, there's really two graphs that they looked at. One is data from the field study. And so if we interpret this graph, what we see is that on the y-axis, they're measuring the plasma corticosterone. That's just another way of saying the amount of this chemical in their blood, right? Plasma is the liquid part of your blood. They measured it in nanograms per milliliters, which is a very small amount. So we see that this is the concentration of corticosterone, which we can call CORT for short, on the left. Down here is how long after they captured the bird. So right when they captured the bird, they took a blood sample, and then 15 minutes later, they still have the bird in captivity. They take another blood sample, and then a half hour after they first caught it, they go ahead and they take another blood sample, and they measure the corticosterone. And what we find is that these are only females. What we find is that when they're first captured, their CORT levels are pretty low. And over time, after 15 minutes, we have got this big spike. So the birds are very, very nervous. And I'll show you what this looks like when they're handling these birds. And then it kind of levels off a little bit, but it's still elevated. So we find the birds get nervous. And what I want you to do in your packet, there's some questions, and I'll show you what those look like. Those questions are over here with part B. I want you to respond to some of these questions after looking at these graphs, these 3 questions after the graphs. I want you to respond to these. It's really easy to see what this connection is between the populations, how the Mount Laguna birds respond differently than the San Diego birds. What this means is that basically I'm asking you, who is more scared right now, even after getting handled? Is it the San Diego birds with the low levels of corticosterone, or is it the Mount Laguna birds with the relatively high levels of corticosterone? So that's what some of the questions are asking. If we look at another graph here, this one on the right, this one we can see the field study alongside the common garden study. Now we talked about that in a previous lesson. What we can see is that there's 4 different groups of birds. The gray ones are from Mount Laguna, and the black ones are from at UCSD. And we've got males, which are these ones with the little arrow, and we've got females, the ones with the little cross on the bottom. And we can also fairly easily see that there's some pretty significant differences, not only between the Mount Laguna and San Diego birds, but also between the males and females. So we see that there's some differences here. So like I just showed you, I want you to go over here and I want you to respond to those questions about these graphs. It's shouldn't be too terribly challenging to try to interpret these graphs. So I want to kind of show you what does it look like for these researchers to handle these birds in the aviaries in Indiana University. I just want you to see this, and I want to point out a few things that they're doing. So I'm going to go ahead and play this video on mute. We can see that they actually capture the birds. They weigh them, they measure them, they're using this tool, these calipers, to measure lengths and things. So they're physically measuring the birds to kind of see how are they different. So this researcher is walking around. This is the aviary, so these are the Juncos living in their place. And what he's doing here is he's actually taking drops of blood in order to measure their corticosterone levels. So you can see that little needle that he just had. And he can even handle the birds. I mean, he can hold them in his hands and handle them. And so right now, these birds are very, very stressed because he's physically holding them, handling them. They're not domesticated, so they're not used to people in the way that dogs and cats are. These birds are very stressed out. So he's measuring their corticosterone levels over the course of this, research, the study, in order to figure out how they change over time. And that's where these graphs are coming from, is that this researcher, a variety of researchers, are actually taking samples from their blood to figure out how much corticosterone that bird has. So that's where these data are actually coming from. What you just saw is the data here for the Common Garden study. The field study is the work that they actually did on campus and in Mount Laguna. So to end, before I upload the video on annotating that abstract that's in your reading, I do want you to go ahead and I want you to answer these questions based on the graphs here. And then in the next video, we'll come back up here, we'll annotate this just to make perfectly clear this is exactly what the study was asking, what they did, and then what they found out. So I will see you in that video so we can annotate this abstract, but until then, happy hunting.